Well, thank you so much, Professor Lisandro Pérez, for joining me today to discuss both your past contributions and experiences to the world of Cuban studies, as well as those contemporary ones. So I want to begin with the question of your return to Miami. I mean, you graduated from the University of Florida, did your undergraduate degree at the University of Miami, but then came here for both the master's and for the PhD. So you are, one of us in some ways. and then you went away for the early part of your academic career and returned to Miami in 1985, where you had a pioneering role, both at FIU, which is a relatively new institution, as well as a founding role when you created the Cuban Research Institute at FIU and became its director for 12 years. So I wonder if you could speak to the challenges that you faced in those years, mid-'80s forward, in terms of the political culture of Miami at the time.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I'm so glad to be here, forming part of this great effort that you've launched at what I consider my alma mater. I mean, the University of Florida was a place where I decided that I wanted to be an academic and work on Cuba, and the great resources there and the great faculty in the Latin American Center were just, instrumental in that. I did go away, as you say, and that was to Louisiana, of all places, for 11 years. And then I got the offer to chair the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at FIU. So I didn't go back to FIU to establish the Cuban Research Institute. I actually went back to be a department chair. And I did that for 6 years. In the course of those years, I realized that FIU was really in a privileged position to really develop some infrastructure, some academic infrastructure for the study of Cuba. It had such a large student population of Cuban origin, and it was building a very credible core of faculty on Cuba, and about I believe it was around 1989 or so, we had a conflict with the Cuban-American National Foundation in which they tried through the legislature to institute a program on Cuba at the university controlled by them. And that sort of prompted us to say, we need to have our own unit. Fortunately, that was rebuffed. That is, they didn't do that, but it made the faculty aware that we needed to have some, vehicle for the study of Cuba. So I put together a faculty committee. We drew up a plan. It got the support of the administration, and we launched it in 1991. And I directed it for 12 years. I think it was an effort in Miami to really have a strong academic presence with respect to Cuba in Miami, where I think it really belonged in many ways, that is, in the heart of the Cuban-American community. There were a lot of challenges. I was intent from the beginning in it being an institute that would abide by all the principles of academic research and public programming and so forth. So there were we were attacked quite a bit on the radio. It was always a sort of we were getting always a lot of attacks. We made it a point of inviting scholars from Cuba, and that was also a sore point. We got a fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation to bring scholars on Cuba at FIU. That was always seen a bit controversial. But it wasn't, I think it was easier to do then than it is, I think, to do now. Yeah. And in many ways, one of the reasons that I decided, and I think we mutually decided, me and the administration, that I would leave the directorship of the Institute was because I think the political situation had changed. Back in the 90s, the danger that you had, the challenges you faced, was that they'd insult you on the radio, or they might throw a chair at you in Versailles. But what happened later with the consolidation of political control by Cuban Americans, where, Dante Fascell and Claude Pepper got replaced by Cuban American Congress people, where most of the legislative delegation to Tallahassee was made up of Cubans.
Mm.
That made it more susceptible. It made FIU more susceptible to those pressures. Besides, the president then used to report to a board in Tallahassee. And that was no longer, that changed to local boards. And in which, again, the local board that governed FIU, the Board of Trustees, was more susceptible also to the local pressures. So it became more difficult to do that because the power had sort of shifted. And I sort of realized that, I think, and I felt I couldn't do what I wanted to do in the CRI, and eventually I got an offer to come to New York.
That's fascinating. I wonder, it's kind of ironic too, given the various political projects that we are now dealing with in the state of Florida, that includes, as Governor DeSantis has said, an interest in eliminating the faculty from faculty hiring decisions. I mean, it's really getting scary and at a major level, and not just with regard to Cuban agendas or Cuban-American agendas. So, I mean, one more question on that point. When you were in Miami, what do you think was what was the greatest kind of impact that this political culture of hostility and almost taboo, I would say, against exchanges with Cuba? What do you think the impact was on students who were interested in learning more about Cuba?
Well, fortunately, we were able, I think, to do a lot at FIU that brought students in to courses. We actually, the CRI ran, and it's not widely known, ran a couple of study abroad in Cuba courses. So we also always offered a broad range of offerings. We offered a lot of things to students in terms of not only courses, but also research opportunities. We had a program whereby we could fund graduate student research in Cuba on theses and dissertations. And I think also what really was important for us was to have a quality exchange on Cuba. I think that the way we were able to kind of push back on a lot of the criticism from the Cuban community was that we had people of quality come in. We never invited from Cuba anyone who was, for example, from a political organization. We always invited people who, had a publication record, who were research. Our first invitee from Cuba was Manuel Moreno Frajinals, and I mean, I wanted to go. We brought him in. He had not yet migrated, let's say, to the U.S. We brought him in. We filled up one of the ballrooms there in GC building in FIU. And a couple of people came with the intention of disrupting. But, when Moreno started talking about, sugar prices and slave trade and went into all of that, they got a little bored and left. So I think they always assume in Miami that if we were bringing in people from Cuba, it was because they were going to have some kind of political meeting. And that wasn't it. One of the next persons we brought was Alicia Garcia Santana, who was an expert on Cuban colonial architecture. She gave this beautiful thing on, medios puntos and so forth. And, some people came to disrupt, but then, they didn't find anything they could disrupt. So I think part of it was that we were focused not on bringing a political agenda at all, but indeed the kind of studies that could contribute to Cuban culture, to Cuban history. And I think our students benefited from that, and I think the community benefited from that.
Yeah, I definitely benefited from that because it was a precedent. I mean, I was still very young in my own graduate career, and you set precedents by showing that, scholarship did exist in Cuba and that intellectuals were willing, in fact, to resist the politicization of their own careers and education by being true scholars and not ideologically driven kind of automatons, which is often how, to this day, certain sectors of the right wing depict Cuban intellectuals, all of them, regardless of who they might be and what they have done. So speaking of which, I recently was in Miami, and one of the things that has been at the forefront of concern among all of us who have great interest in Cuba and in freedom in Cuba, as well as freedom in Miami and freedom elsewhere, is this sort of massive and radical shift away in Miami from, I would sort of estimate about 10 years of a gradual softening and political opening, both to the possibility of changing U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba and in terms of its policy of isolation, as well as just in general being more open to understanding Cuba from within. And that has really changed. And I wonder, given the heights of hostility and extreme rejection of not just Obama's policy, but Obama himself, rejection of immigrants by other immigrants, Cuban immigrants, the rejection at all levels of sort of where we were going, and the new direction in which Cubans in Miami in particular, at least those who are vocal about it, have headed. I wonder what you think explains this dramatic changing of directions away from opening towards not just isolationism and hostility with regard to the Cuban government, but just in terms of with regard to islanders. I wonder what you could say to that.
I think it is a disturbing trend. I believe that there are certain elements of that ideology that have always been present in the Cuban American community. That is the sort of and it's a position, and we used to call it in sociology, which is really my field, when we started minority groups, a kind of the authoritarian personality. That is the idea that you don't want to see things in black and white. This is your truth, and you are willing to be extreme in pursuing that. I think that's always been the case in the Cuban community. What I think has happened is that for a long time, that sort of position did not have a lot of acceptance, for example, in sort of mainstream discourse. It was okay for the radio stations, and it thrived in the radio stations, and in some of the periodiquitos and the tabloids and so forth. But I think what's happened is that the Trump phenomenon has sort of made that kind of discourse legitimate. Mm-hmm. It has given it legitimacy, and it's like, yes, that's what we felt all along. We see things in black and white. We don't want to be tolerant of other positions. And it has to do not just with Cuba, I think, but with a range of other issues that Cubans have, some Cubans in Miami have identified with, that have been part of that Trump agenda. So I think it's been sort of given a momentum by the entire national trend, which is in the direction in which a lot of Cubans have tended to go in terms of their ideology. The other thing is that when I taught a course on Cubans in the U.S., which I established in the sociology department at FIU, which, by the way, might be threatened by the imposition of eliminating diversity and inclusion courses in the state system. But that course that I taught Cubans in the U.S., I would say to the students way back, well, we can expect that generationally, right, there would be a new generation of leaders who would not have that resentment and so forth of the first generation, and would act in ways that are more moderate with respect to Cuba. Well, that hasn't happened. To a very large extent, the power in the Cuban community still resides in the traditional or in the historic migration of the 60s and 70s. Only now it's their children. If you look at who are the people in the state legislature, if you look at who are a lot of the people who are at the head of many of the institutions that are putting this forward, this kind of ideology, you find that they're second or third generation from that original group that has managed to reproduce that sort of political ideology across generations, right? And so it's interesting to me that now many of the people who are in the Cuban community espousing these views are again second, third generation Cuban Americans. I think also, if I could just add, it is the case that many people coming from Cuba are accustomed to a particular type of exclusionary political discourse, in which they themselves had been victims of them in Cuba, but they find it sort of legitimate when they hear it on their side, expressing their point of view, right? And so the idea of tolerance and the notion that what a democracy really is a respect for the rights of the minority and for different points of view, that's not something that we're seeing from the political culture that's coming out of Cuba. And the only thing is that in Cuba, they were victims of that same thinking, right? But here they've latched onto it, and it's a very curious thing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It's very disturbing, and the absence of knowledge of what pluralism should be. That's virtually the objective number one of the Cuban communist state and its pedagogy from the early 60s through the present. And we see the results in a really intense way, I think, among some of the youngest people who come in the United States. So I wonder if, since you have a great deal of knowledge about your own family's relationship to these struggles, and have written, one book was published in 2018, and that book has been published in both English and Spanish. It's about Cuban New York, and now you have a new book that is a history of your own family. I wonder if you could talk about how the relationship, the transnational and transcultural relationship between Cuba and the United States developed in New York. That's the topic of the 2018 book. And then speak about how your own family's history is a way of illuminating the struggles and the tensions and the conflicts, as well as the commonalities and the patterns that define Cuba and the United States.
Well, thank you for that question, because anytime you get a chance to talk about your own work, that's even, especially, and not talk about these other very depressing aspects of what's going on in the political culture of Miami. So I was trained as a sociologist. My PhD is in sociology and in Latin American studies, and from University of Florida. And but my interest has always been the study of Cuba, and particularly of Cuban-Americans. And so a lot of my early work had to do, especially with the contemporary Cuban communities, especially in Miami, using sociological methods. But more and more, I realized that there were a lot of things that we didn't know about the earlier Cuban presence in the United States, and that earlier Cuban presence actually had some patterns, as I could see, that were not too dissimilar to what I was seeing in Miami in many ways. And I felt that there had been a fair amount of work done on Tampa and Key West, but I felt that New York was this topic that had been ignored. And if you look at where Martí developed, if you look at even the earlier movements, the annexationists, where did the Cuban flag fly for the first time? The entire activity of those Cubans with respect to the 10 Years' War, there was a long history there that I felt had really not been researched. So I became, with apologies to historians like you, I became a kind of a historian and went back. Of course, I was still a sociologist, because my first instinct was not to go to the archives. My first instinct was to go to the census, like a good sociologist. So I started digging up all the censuses of the 19th century and try to really build that community, because I felt that what we did know about the community was strictly its political activism, especially Martí, right? But these people existed in a community. There were, in 1870, there were 3,000 persons born in Cuba in the city of New York. So, what was the community like? Was it stratified? Were there Afro-Cubans? Where did they live? And that's really the topic of that book. And what I turned out doing was writing a lot of stories. And I found out that maybe I was good at writing stories, which is not something sociologists usually do. Stories of those families that lived in New York. And then when I finished that, I said, I have some stories that I've accumulated over the course of my lifetime, because even since I was a child in Cuba, I asked to be told stories about my ancestors. And I've accumulated those stories. I've done research on my ancestors, and I felt that's not something that I could keep to myself. I had to write about it, especially since more and more I was seeing the connections between the stories of my ancestors and really the convulsions, if you will, the very the dramatic history of Cuba, starting since the beginning of the 19th century. And so, I finished this book now, which is coming out in October. It's called The House on G Street, a Cuban family saga. I called it the House on G Street because that is La Casa de la Calle G was essentially my family's home, of my father's family in Cuba. And you know, along the way I talk about a couple of mambises, and it gives me the idea of covering my family's story gives me a way to talk about Cuban history in a kind of a micro sense. And there's been a lot of emphasis lately on family history, especially in African American history, to kind of reclaim that history of families and write about their struggles. Now, in the case of my family, it was not a family that had struggles economically. It wasn't like Kendra Field's book, for example, in which she talks about her own family and the challenges they faced being marginalized and having a slave, you know, ancestry and past in the United States. My family was somewhere in the upper reaches of Cuban society before the revolution. But it's also, however, a story that, if not told, can be lost, because that entire history of the people who shaped Cuba at that time, in their time and their place, has literally been swept away. And I think that there's a lot of interest even in Cuba among younger generations who walk among sort of the ruins or the remains of the homes that were occupied by that social class that in a sense determined so much of Cuban history. They sort of wonder who lived here, right? What was this past like? And there has been lately some historiography, as you know, on the Cuban Republic, but it tends to be, again, very macro, very in the context of U.S. you know, influence on Cuba and so forth. I don't think there's really been a good history of what was that social class, that sort of elite that lived in Cuba at that time, and how did they live, you know, and how did they adjust to the many challenges that a transition from colony to U.S. intervention to republic to revolution, how did they adjust to that? And so that's what that story is about.
You know, I love this notion that you just mentioned about walking among the ruins and growing up wondering what happened, because that's exactly, I mean, it's like a microcosmic way of understanding why people like myself, when we go to Cuba to do research on one thing, we end up learning so much from Cubans themselves about another period of history, because it's natural to ask questions and to be to wonder what happened. And nowhere else can you find it often in Cuba except in the personal archive that is another Cuban of an older generation, or somebody who's not a member of your family and doesn't protect the same taboos. Well, I think there's an intensity to Cuban identity, and we like to criticize and you know, we all do this, our mea culpa, that we are often exceptionalists, and we think that our experiences are unique. And yet I also think there is, you know, there is a certain element of perhaps it's the island nature of our community on the island, and then the different islands that we occupy in the United States. There is a certain degree of intensity among Cubans who identify with Cubanness and with Cuba. There's an intensity to that identification that isn't necessarily the case, you know, maybe across all Cubans, but certainly not necessarily the case when it comes to any other group with which I have had contact. So I wonder, as just a last note, what do you think the legacy of your own work will be with respect to, you know, our ability as a community, as a nation, to retain a sense of commitment to Cuba, to Cubanness, and to the continuing exploration of what that means?
So I think that my dedication to the fact that I focus really on Cuba is a reflection of the fact that you know, I belong to that generation of that Gustavo Pérez called the 1.5 generation. That is, those of us who were children in Cuba. We have a memory of Cuba before the revolution, right? We lived there, and then this happened, and all of a sudden we weren't living where we were supposed to be living, and we sort of asked ourselves, what happened, and I think that generation has created a fairly large number of us that are now, finishing careers, if you will, that have dedicated themselves to Cuba precisely because again, when place, we take for granted place, but when place is lost, it takes on a particular significance. And I think many of us in that generation that went into academia and to study Cuba are in many ways through different fields trying to understand more about what happened. And I think that has been extremely valuable overall. I think I think Cuban Studies has at the core that sort of concern with Cuba from a very personal level that has driven a lot of us to study Cuba and to try to study it as honestly as possible. If you're trying to find something about yourself in the work that you're doing, you want to be as honest as possible. You don't want to be, pamphletary, if you will. You don't want to try to be politically biased. And I think that as was evident in the interview, for example, that you had with Carmelo Mesalago and so on. I mean, I didn't think that the study of Cuba was possible when I left Miami and went to Gainesville. Yeah, I thought leaving that atmosphere of Miami, I thought I'm going to dedicate myself to something else. And then Carmelo Mesalago came to give a guest lecture the first semester I was in Gainesville. I remember it was in the attic of the old library where it was a small group, and he talked about availability and reliability of statistics from socialist Cuba, right? And it was an extremely in many ways it was a vintage Carmelo, right? In other words, stick to the facts, right? And the presentation wasn't particularly let's say entertaining, let's put it that way, right? It was rather dry and boring, but that was the miracle of it. It was, this guy does work on Cuba, right? And he does serious work. This is possible, right? And so I think it's been part of our identity as Cuban Americans, I think, to really try, those of us who've been studying it for a long time, to try to really, in many ways, find out something about ourselves and the process by which we found ourselves having our life totally altered. I'm not sure that's answered your question, but no, it has to do at least with what I think is and I think Cuban Studies has taken off, and many, as you know. I mean, the stuff that's being done when we established the Conference on Cuban and Cuban American Studies at CRI, and which started when I was director there. We said, let's just do a call for papers, and we were amazed at what we got. I mean, from Japan, from all kinds of places, people working on Cuba.
Yeah, that is an amazing point. And all of it you've done is greatly appreciated by my generation and all of those that are up and coming. So thank you for participating in this. Thank you, Lisandro.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for this project that you're launching at the University of Florida.